The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar from the Global Trade and Supply Chain Institute. Drug Supply Chain Security Act, DSCSA. Are you ready to comply with DSCSA? First, we have a few logistics. If at any point you have trouble hearing the audio, you can send a chat or question to Organizer via the Ask a Question window on the lower right side of your GoToWebinar console. If you have questions about the presentation, we will collect those and we will ask them of the presenter during the Q&A at the end. Also, now or at any time, you can download a PDF copy of the slides in the Handouts section, and you can follow along with those. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online along with a copy of the slides available for all registered participants at www.gtsci.org, and you will receive an email tomorrow with this link and information. First of all, the Global Trade and Supply Chain Institute was established to incorporate a single resource that offers all modes of training, whether it be via webinar, in-person seminars, boot camps, or on-site training for individuals and teams. Now, today's presenter is Christos Leonardakis, an attorney with the Braumiller Law Group. He has served multi-billion-dollar publicly traded companies, small to medium-sized export trading companies, and Vice President and General Counsel for a German export trade company. His experience in various export enforcement investigations and FBI cases gives him unique skills and insight on the risks of global trade and global supply chains. He has been interviewed by Supply Chain Brain, and he is a frequent speaker with U.S. government agencies, including the Department of Commerce, SBA, SBDC, and he is a member of InfraGard, an FBI-led association of subject matter experts. And with that, I will turn things over to Christos. So Christos, you can begin.
Thank you, Rick. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy schedule today to join us. Also, good afternoon and good evening to those who are joining us from overseas. As you can see from the agenda, we'll be discussing the background overview of this act, the type of information to be exchanged. We'll be comparing the California pedigree system versus the DSCSA system. We'll discuss the implementation plan and timeline for this new act and how it's going to impact your companies. A little overview of the suspect and illegitimate products and then the consequences for non-compliance both on your company, shareholders, and customers, then the benefits of the act, and then how to prepare for this act. So hopefully you'll be able to gain from this webinar a stronger understanding on the DSCSA regulations, focus on real-world practices and examples that are going to be given in this webinar, and then obviously the focus on consequences of not complying with the DQSA and the DSCSA. Next slide, Rick. So as you can see from the background, we're going to be looking at the threats to security and patient safety today. We're going to look at the documented history of counterfeit drugs at the distributor and dispenser level, the history of drug theft from manufacturer, warehouses, or containers, and then high market risks, and especially around shortage products or high-valued products, pharmaceutical products. We're going to discuss a little bit on the inconsistencies between the states, and thus the reason for the DSCSA, how certain protection levels were substandard for certain states as opposed to the federal level, the conflicts between the state requirements, which made it difficult for enforcement and for other states and companies like yourselves to comply with, and then obviously the California pedigree system, which kind of laid the foundation of why the new act went into place. So you can see that over the last decades, as far as the globalization and the supply chain complexity, these posed various type of risks to the pharmaceutical safety in industry, and therefore trying to mitigate those risks both from a patient safety as well as from a corporate standpoint was the reason why the act went into effect. Not to mention the fact that now in today's world you can go online, order pharmaceutical drugs from various countries. They're now being manufactured elsewhere, China, Asia, India, and other countries, and the potential risk of those type of drugs not meeting the U.S. standards or substandards in what's in the ingredient. So therefore, the act was implemented. Next slide, please. This chart shows an overview of the act. We're going to be concentrating, obviously, on Title II of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. We won't be discussing much on Title I, the Compounding Quality Act. Just as an overview, that basically was wanted to ensure the compounding drugs, which were not regulated by the FDA in limited quantities. There are a number of cases, one in specific being the a steroid case whereby about 800 people ended up getting sick. The Title II is looking at primarily the imports and the supply chain security concerns. So obviously any company that's joined us today will need to look at their supply chain and work closely with their logistics departments. So this is basically Title II is part of a long-term strategy that the U.S. has been trying for several years now to implement, both from a system standpoint and a technology standpoint, to try to discourage and intervene on any type of counterfeit drugs that may be entering the consumer market. We can go on to the next slide. Now, in the overview here, you can see that the outline as far as the steps to build an electronic system, basically similar to what you're seeing in other agencies, particularly like U.S. Customs, where they're going on a single platform, looking at EDI interfaces as far as the transmission of information. So it's planned that the system, I would say more, it's hoped that the system will allow for the exchange of the information at the package level. So what you're really looking at is at the genesis of the product throughout the entire supply chain. So the three objectives, as you can see there, the ability to verify the legitimacy of a product down to the package level. For those who can recall the Tylenol case, that's exactly what they're trying to address. They want to enhance the detection and notification of the illegitimate products, and obviously the ability to facilitate recalls of drug products. So what they're looking at as far as the these three steps is basically, again, a chain of custody, and I'll be speaking repeatedly on chain of custody. This is critical for U.S. government enforcement cases. What they're looking to do is to establish the where, what, when, who is responsible for these drugs and in the supply chain. So again, as we speak in this webinar, your goal is to try to put the procedures, the controls, both from a standard operating procedures as well as from IT procedures to address each touch point. So in the event of a drug recall, you want the FDA and the enforcement agencies, or let's say it's U.S. Customs that intercepts a shipment that's supposed to be on the shelves of, let's say, hypothetically, Walgreens. You've got a deadline, you've got breach of contracts. You want to have the procedures, the IT controls in place by, obviously, 2023 and sooner, depending on what category you fall into, in order to trace those prescription drugs in the distribution channel. In that way, if something should go wrong, you're able to at least immediately address the issue with the enforcement agencies, and then they'll move down the supply chain. So that's the one lesson I give many companies, whether they're small, medium, or multi-billion-dollar corporations. The goal is in an enforcement action or in a recall, whether it's food or drugs, whatever the case may be, where the consumer may be impacted negatively or even result in death, is, you know, as we will show in these cases, you want to be able to have those enforcement officers move to the next person or company in the supply chain, and therefore allow you to continue on with your business. So this is basically a centerpiece, a national effort, so to say, to secure the farmer supply chain, obviously from the entry of any type of counterfeit products, you know, whether it's diversion of a product, and tighter licensing, as we'll discuss in FDA inspection. So it's going to give companies ability to handle life-saving medical products in the appropriate safety environment. Next slide, please. Here you have the overview again of the Act. As I discussed, this is going to enhance the FDA's ability to protect U.S. consumers by various detection methods that they have and methodologies. Obviously, the goal is to remove potentially dangerous products from the pharmaceutical supply chain. So the end goal, again, is stopping drug counterfeiting in order to protect the patients. The Act is an important step, obviously, in addressing and ensuring the patient safety. It will take several years to actually realize full implementation and work its way within the supply chain and the distribution channels. As its second bullet there shows, it's going to strengthen the security, add additional controls as far as the pharmaceutical track, and again, that chain of custody, and the traceability with the systems that now are going to be on a national standard for wholesalers, distributors, and third-party logistics. So you're looking at each of those areas, and whether you're a wholesale distributor, a 3PL, a pharmacist, a manufacturer, each one will have a standard that's going to be universal across the country and be able to obviously leverage synergies within each of the companies and best practices in order to prohibit the introduction of counterfeit drugs or potentially dangerous drugs. Continue on to the next slide, please. So we're going to begin talking about the information to be exchanged. Basically, what the Act is looking to do is the trading partners, manufacturers, dispensers, everybody is going to provide transaction documentation to the subsequent purchasers for any type of prescription drugs. There are exemptions, and I'll discuss those. So what you're looking at again is the genesis of the birth of a prescription drug all the way down to the consumer, the genealogy, for a better word, as to how they're going to track that in order to intervene on any type of counterfeit drugs. So examples, the Act is defining these prescription drugs as products which are finished drugs, and again, we'll discuss this a little bit later in the webinar, that are intended for human use. So examples, you could see there, capsules, tablets, products before reconstitution. So each entity in the supply chain, from the original manufacturer to the end distributor, is going to need to provide this type of documentation for certain prescription drugs coming into and out of possession, and then these will be traced by the federal agencies, and we'll show later on the various offices that will be involved in the additional resources to the government. Now, it's important for those on the phone today to understand, and certain companies have joined us today, that not all pharmaceutical products are being impacted by the new law. There are exclusions from product definition, and if you're in doubt as to the product definition under this Act, highly recommend looking at the FDA's website, where there's additional information. But some product exclusions are things such as blood components or blood for transfusion, biologics, radioactive drugs, imaging drugs, intravenous type of drugs that you would get in the IV for hydration. Homeopathic drugs are exempted, and certain compounded drugs also are exempted. So I guess the first step that you'd want to take is to see if your products that you're purchasing fall under the definition of products. And if they do, those are the products you're going to want to concentrate on. If they don't, then the Act is either not going to apply to you, or it's only going to apply to your company in various products excuse me, that you're dealing in. We can move on to the next slide. So again, the information to be exchanged, and we're going to concentrate on this slide and various slides that are addressing the TI, the TH, and the TS. Basically, what the transaction documentation, it's going to be provided either in paper or electronic format, but it's going to need to be maintained for a minimum of 6 years. It's important to understand that in a lot of companies that I've seen, IT could have an aggressive destruction policy. It's critical in your record management or record retention requirements that you look at this area and you ensure that your IT department has the ability to retrieve these records, e-discovery, metadata, whatever the means may be in the event of enforcement action. So the transaction documentations consist, as you could see, from the transaction, which will include the lot number, except for certain wholesalers or distributor transaction, the TH, which is the history of the transaction. Again, think of it as a genealogy tree, and then the transaction statement, which we'll discuss as to what's going to be included on there. So before purchasing medications, the supplier should be verifying their supplier's licenses. And again, this can be done online. The FDA has a website. It's recommended that you check that at least on a yearly basis or as it applies to your business. And again, the three areas that primarily we'll be discussing, again, are the TI, the TH, and the TS. We can move on to the next slide. So how will those three elements, data elements, appear to pharmacies, meaning the TI, TH, and TS? Basically, pharmacies are going to have the ability to pull the transactional information from the distributor's electronic ordering platform. So again, if you're working with your IT department, I know in large companies, it can take months to get a project started from your IT department. When we discuss the timeline and the implementation a little bit later, you're going to want to plan for that accordingly with your IT department in order to be able to pull that information from the distributor's electronic data feed. And you can see what the TI information will include: the product name, the strength and dosage, the NDC number, the type of container size, the number of containers, the lot, the transaction, and obviously the shipment information, the address of the businesses, previous and subsequent owners, the name and addresses of those businesses. So in essence, the wholesalers that are going to purchase products directly from a manufacturer or exclusive distributor of the manufacturer, or a repackager, in case there's any companies on the phone today that repackager that purchases products, again, directly from the manufacturer, they're going to be exempt from passing along these data elements. Anybody else within that group that the Act is encompassing will be required to provide this type of information. So if I was a company and I was looking at my current practices, I would take the look and see if these particular elements are being captured today. If not, how are you going to address that? How are you going to capture that information? How are you going to record it? And what type of IT support is going to be necessary for you to meet these standards? That is the approach, again, that I recommend companies should take. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, as you can see, the TH is basically a statement in paper electronic form that's going to include the transaction information for each prior transaction going back to the manufacturer. Again, the chain of custody. Every single person that touches that particular product or transaction is going to be able to record that back all the way through the supply chain. Again, in the event of a recall, the feds will be able to go in and see exactly what will be where the transaction started and where it ended. The TS statement, and we'll discuss again what those elements, again, either paper or electronic form. There's a lot of companies that still are doing paper form, is going to look at the transfer of ownership. So they're going to look at whether it's authorized as far as the party is authorized as required under the Act, received the product from a person that is authorized or unauthorized, and then receiving the TI and TS from the prior owner of the product. So again, we're establishing a chain of custody. Again, if I'm looking at my compliance program and I'm looking at my current operations, I'm going to be looking at to see what do I have that meets those requirements. Whatever areas that are a gap and I would suggest doing a gap analysis. I would suggest doing recalls. I've done this before, hypothetical recalls through the entire supply chain. I've done these with plants in the U.S. and manufacturing in Mexico, whereby a false order or a corrupt order is put into the system, into your ERP system, whether you're using SAP or Oracle, goes through the entire supply chain, and I've been on the opposite end, starting point of Mexico into the U.S. to see exactly what happens and where those weaknesses are. You're better off taking that approach and doing hypothetical drills in the event you identify gaps, as opposed to having it happen in a real-world scenario where the repercussions could be severe both to your consumers as well as to your company's financials. We're going to move on to the next slide, which is the California pedigree system. As you can see there, I'm not going to go through block by block, but what you're basically looking at is the THS, the THR, the TI, and the TS. You can see the complexity of it. Basically, the TI is the actual information as far as the transactions are concerned with the drugs. The TS is obviously the transaction statement, and then the THR is the history. So you have TI as 1, TI number 2, and TI number 3. So if I was to use, as far as the genesis, the transaction information would be the buyer, the seller, the lot number, the NDC, as we explained in the previous slide. This is what's actually on the invoice. That then flows down to the TS. So let's say hypothetically, I'll use Cardinal Health. You know, Division 401 is a licensed wholesaler for the state of Illinois. They then do an attestation, and then the THS is going to show the transaction history when it's shipped. So you have a manufacturer, let's say Mylan, again using hypothetical scenario, sells to Cardinal Health. Cardinal Health then sells to, let's say, Walmart or Walgreens, who own distribution centers, and then who sell to the independent pharmacies. So it's important, and I'll discuss this again later on, when some of the information that you're putting in there, especially on at the attestation statement, you are very cognizant of the fact that you're ensuring that what you put in there is true and correct. So anything that's false, you can also invoke the False Statements Act. So it does establish a liability to the company who's not complying. So the TS2 basically was a 2 history, the medicine, shipping, etc. And so even though the system appeared to be okay, there were flaws in that. So a lot of people asked, didn't we try this before? And yes, we did. But the initiative, it didn't really take hold as a program. So they looked at that, what could be different under the DQSA, and they started approaching that. That also was a state level requirement. It was not a national law. So there was no way of dictating what type of data. They had to be interchanged between the supply chain participants, who controlled that data. There were enormous privacy issues actually on who controlled that data, as you could imagine, especially under HIPAA and other regulations. And there was no way of really knowing where the data interchange was happening. And so they looked at all of those. There was no single point of contact, etc., to figure out how they could protect that data, what format, the entry points, and therefore they went into the current act, which is the DSCSA. We can move on to the next slide. So here we have the act today. It's kind of much more simpler. Basically, again, reiterating, the transaction information is showing everything is on your invoice at this time. So it's allowing between all the parties a combined history. The transaction information from all previous owners in the supply chain and in your system. So it outlined, as far as the act is concerned, it's outlined the critical steps to build this type of electronic interoperable system. which hopefully will meet the November 27th, 2023 deadline. So it's going to trace certain prescription drugs. We spoke already through as to what's exempt. It's going to mean that each trading partner is going to maintain the product information and transaction history. So you're going to have the ability to look at the previous transaction history, the source, and the subsequent recipient of the prescription drugs. So basically the system is going to go right back to the actual point that the drugs were made, what again I call the genesis of the product. Keep in mind that the transaction information is basically the basic data about the drug and the change of ownership. Then you're looking at the TH. That's going to be the transaction information is going to be passed from one previous owner to the other. For most shipments, manufacturers, though, will not need the TH because that's obviously the point of origin. And then the transaction statement, again, look at what the FDA is going to require. There's going to be 7 distinct assertions that the company is going to have to make. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when you're making that attestation and you're signing off on that, it can be used against you. And also, if anything is falsely put in there, obviously you have the False Statements Act. Again, and then what you're looking at, by November 27, 2017, the manufacturer is going to need to provide the TI, TH, and the TS in electronic format. So again, going back to the IT requirements, you want to make sure that you've already alerted your IT department far enough upstream in order for them to meet those requirements. There are exceptions to this. Shipping directly to a licensed healthcare practitioner who's authorized to prescribe it, or an administrator medication under state law. Those type of exemptions also exist, and those are outlined in the FDA. We can move on to the next slide. The implementation plan. So what I've seen here, and I'm not going to read through every single FDA office that's being involved, but what you're looking at here today is you're looking at a lot more oversight. I'm hearing a lot of companies saying they need full-time staff, just compliance officers, just to be able to deal with the regulatory environment. Keep in mind, you're not only dealing with the DSCSA, but you're also dealing with other acts that are impacting your industry. But at the end of the day, the resources are now going to be available to the FDA. Again, that means more resources from an enforcement standpoint as well. So basically, the law is going to require, and you have all these offices involved, that the FDA develops standards that the industry can use on a national level. Guidances, obviously the regulations, pilot programs, licensing programs, in order to make it more efficient and effective to meet the implementation deadlines of this law. They are holding public meetings as well. So again, you want to take a look at the FDA website. You want to look at the FDA offices that are involved in the implementation. There's a wealth of information in there. It's probably easiest to assign a project manager who takes a look at all of this and then takes it upstairs within your organization and begins to meet these requirements. We can move on to the next slide, Rick. This is the implementation timeline. I'm not going to go step by step on this. You could see it was enacted in November of 2013. Then in 2014, you had the state preemption, the FDA guidance. You had the PMDA, which is the Pharmaceutical Medical Devices Agencies. Here's basically what you're looking at in this slide is the prescription drug traceability timeline. You're looking at where it started on January 1st, 2015 for those that are manufacturers, wholesalers, or repackagers on the phone. Then in July of 2015, on July 1st, the pharmacies, which hospitals and retail, and then the sharing the 3 T's, the TI, the TH, and the TS at the lot or batch level for identification. The midterm area of 2017 to 2019 is the manufacturers and repackagers for serializing packages of drug products using either the NDC, the National Drug Code, or the GTIN. Again, you're looking at serial number, lot number, and expiration date. So if I was a company and I was in the IT department, I'd be looking at the 2017-2019 midterm and saying, okay, how am I going to meet those deadlines? What am I going to need in order to serialize the product, to trace the product by serial number, lot number, and expiration number? So that's absolutely critical. And again, by 2023. And then you're going to need to make this available to your trading partners. So again, you're tracing it back to the ownership, to the initial manufacturer, the repackager. It's important to understand that some parts of the Act won't take effect until 2017 or 28, but it's very critical that you're reaching out at this point with any of your trading partners to see what they have in their pipeline as far as operations, IT, etc., to meet these requirements both from a domestic and international level. So you need to be able to plan for the flexibility to address any type of changes that may come down between now and 2018 as far as your operations are concerned. The resources that are going to be required, as I mentioned, can easily be underestimated, and I think most of the companies have had to deal with IT departments, which are stretched thin within most companies. Understand that the project plans need to be given as quickly as possible depending on your internal and external resources. So you're going to need to align those with your existing manufacturing, your existing distribution, your processes, your quality control, your legal departments. So that's the approach that I'd be taking at. Look at each of the departments that are going to be affected by this. Look at your trading partners. See what they have in place today. You may have trading partners that are way ahead of the game. Try to leverage their best practices. And then get all that together, develop the project team, develop the project timeline, get the IT department in order to meet these requirements so you can meet this implementation timeline. Next slide, please. So after November 27, 2017, the Act will require the manufacturer to apply the DSCSA product identifier. You can see that there to all drug packages entering the supply chain. So the serial number, expiration date, NDC code, and the lot number. Again, the repackagers have till 2018 to do that. Talking with a number of pharmaceutical companies and other trading partners are impacted. The investment can be substantial. For smaller companies, I'm hearing ranges of $150,000 to larger companies, $500,000 just to install the serialization machinery. So you're looking again at your operations, you're looking at your manufacturing lines, you're working with your plants to determine, okay, what type of barcode printers are going to need, what machine vision systems, similar items like that in order to address the serialization. Are you doing it on a single packaging line? You know, what are those additional costs that are going to be incurred for that particular manufacturing plant? You're going to need to look at your enterprise level IT systems to collect and store and deliver this traceability data. I see time and time again, especially with large multi-billion-dollar companies, disparate IT systems. That makes it very difficult as it is today for other compliance areas, but it's going to make it extremely difficult when it comes to implementing and complying with this act. So again, if you have disparate IT systems today that are not communicating, you're going to want to address those sooner than later and figure out how you're going to get those on one single platform in order to comply with this act. We can move on to the next slide, Rick. Suspect and illegitimate products. So here are some examples of products which they believe the product is potentially, the reason they believe it's suspect, it's either counterfeit or it's been diverted or stolen. Again, I would emphasize on the stolen. Take a look at the FDA's site. They do have high alert drugs that are on there, that the more expensive drugs, and try to tailor your operations towards that. Intentionally adulterated products that would result in serious adverse health or death to humans. The subject of the fraudulent transaction and otherwise appears unfit for distribution, which could result in adverse consequences to the patient or even death. So again, what it's looking to do is protect, obviously, the consumer from the counterfeit, adulterated, or contaminated drugs. So that is their objective. These are some of the definitions, as I just discussed. Basically what they're looking at is, from an illegitimate product, the standard which is established is based on the above criteria. And so that, again, is going to be something that you're going to want to use for as far as your products are concerned in your supply chain. Again, what I typically highly recommend to companies, and when I go in to establish compliance programs or do audits, I look at the government standards. I either have the company create Excel spreadsheets, which each of the elements of the regulations that pertain to it. If you're a smaller company, you don't need the Rolls Royce of controls. You need to be able to address that. If paper works for the time being, paper works. That's the route you take, with the anticipation that you're going to go into an electronic format. But you can look at each of those standards and then determine what you need to address step by step in that area, and then go from there. We can go on to the next slide. Suspect and illegitimate product. These are just examples. In 2012 and 13, this was the fake vials of cancer. It affected over 900 medical practices in the U.S. It was a counterfeit product. It was branded as Avastin, and it contained no active ingredient. And obviously, this drug was a cancer drug. It was extremely expensive, and therefore, the nature of the suspect drug, there's a higher probability that somebody's going to try to counterfeit that. So this really highlighted the vulnerabilities in the global supply chain, the global medical supply chain, as well as the national nature of what type of criminal trade is focusing on these type of counterfeit medicines. I was recently at a conference last month whereby, again, as we discussed on the previous slide, some of these criminal groups are even scaling warehouses, drilling holes through the ceiling and propelling down into the warehouse in order to steal the drugs, because they know that there's no security in place as far as the roof is concerned. That's the extent that they're going through. That was with an FBI meeting that I had, and they were actually showing the videos of what these criminal groups were doing. So again, you're looking to address those issues. Again, in the U.S., back last April, you had a counterfeit version of the Botox. They were sold at doctors' offices and medical clinics. A doctor's office is going to be very difficult for them to, identify a counterfeit product. And then the product was sold by an unlicensed supplier who wasn't authorized to ship or distribute the products in the United States. And again, what I've seen in a lot of big companies is sometimes a lack of quality controls and traceability of products, of whatever the case might be. This came out in the conflicts mineral regulations, tracing it back again to the genesis of the product. So your purchasing department obviously would be affected by any type of standard operating procedures. So what you're looking is, if the trading partner identifies a suspect product, what is your ability within the 24 hours to notify the FDA and all your trading partners in quarantine? How are you going to do that? So again, the FDA is able to identify some of these products as being suspect, either because the labeling is off, there's discrepancies in the quantities, or in the ingredients, the foreign language sometimes is used. Some of these counterfeit companies make it nearly impossible, other than in a lab, to be able to identify counterfeit products. So it does make it, very difficult for some companies to be able to do this. They're looking at wrong levels of an active ingredient. Again, too little or too much. Think of it as if you were a cancer patient and it was a vial, there was a case where the vial was diluted because I believe it was roughly $10,000 per treatment for this. The doctor wanted to dilute it in order to make more money, and if you're that patient taking that particular treatment for cancer, you got the wrong level of an active ingredient or sometimes too much, and what's the consequences for that? So again, there have been cases where they've even found rat poison in some of these counterfeit products. So again, they're looking at the health, even the life of the consumer in implementing this program. Again, sometimes these drugs are so well disguised from a counterfeit standpoint that the only way of identifying it is through laboratory tests, which is of concern. Now, if I was a company on the phone today or in general, I would look at the cases such as the Avastin. I would look at the cases such as the Botox, look at the FDA's, I would pull the FDA's guidance documents as to what they're looking for for you to build your compliance program and tailor it around that. So it's very easy to look up these cases, to see what the outcome was, to see what the history of this case was, and then build your controls around that. State that, okay, in this case, A, B, and C happened. What am I going to put into place to avoid those issues from coming into play in my particular environment? Next slide, please. This basically came from the Pharmaceutical Security Institute as far as the incidence of pharmaceutical crimes in 2014. There were over 2,000 incidents of pharmaceutical crime in 2014. There were 119 countries were impacted by this crime, this sort of crime. So besides protecting the consumers, it's protecting the industry participants from the stolen goods, counterfeit goods, and therefore that's what the Act is looking to address. This is costing companies millions and millions of dollars as far as this type of theft is concerned. And again, in the meetings that I went to last month with the FBI, some of the cases that they showed where they were actually propelling from the roof was just absolutely amazing. Doing it during the holidays, let's say Memorial Day, they know nobody's working. They scale the walls and they end up using actual pulleys and ropes to get the goods out over the roof. So the magnitude, if you take a look at the PSI studies to understand the top regions of the pharmaceutical crime, is actually quite interesting to take a look at that. Obviously, Asia is a huge area for counterfeit and suspect products that are being generated and then coming into the United States or entering the supply chain. Next slide. Okay, consequences and penalties of noncompliance. What you're looking at is the failure to comply with the requirements can be obviously highly damaging. So obviously the most serious impact is if you had something that was, contaminated, did not have the proper ingredients, you get an adverse patient reaction, and they die. Can your company survive that type of public relations nightmare? So obviously the safety of the drug is of paramount importance here. And so if you're in this industry, not only do you have a legal responsibility, but you have an ethical responsibility that the products that you're selling are not harmful to the patient. So you have to do everything you can to comply with these regulations. Use the resources that the FDA has available. You can see that deficiencies are considered to be so serious that the patient could be at risk. So these could be egregious violations. That's the example I used where the doctor knowingly diluted a drug vial in order to sell more. It was $10,000 per vial. So you're not just looking at a syndication of criminals that may be doing this at times, rarely as it is. You're also seeing doctors that may be looking to take advantage of these weaknesses. You got other consequences, the drug recalls. Again, how quickly would you be able within your supply chain to identify in the event of a recall and stop and quarantine those drugs in it? And that is what you're trying to establish. Obviously, many of the companies, let's say you're selling to a huge type of Costco or Sam's Club or Target or Walmart, if this type of situation occurs, what type of breach of contracts do you have? The quicker you're able to track the lot in the units and what went wrong, the better you're going to be. Obviously, in a bad situation, the FDA is going to suspend your license. You're looking at loss of revenue, legal costs, regulatory, and a drop in the shareholder value. Again, what you're looking there, not to mention the damaged reputation, is the fact that the shareholders today are much more sophisticated, and all you need is one shareholder to file a shareholder lawsuit and the rest join. So they're going to look at the timeline. They're going to say this started in 2013. You had X amount of years. You're going on 3 years, 4 years now to implement this. You were negligent in doing that. It resulted, let's say, in a death of a consumer or several consumers, God forbid, and therefore you're going to have a shareholder lawsuit. What type of protection is the company going to have? How is it going to be able to defend itself? How is it going to be able to defend its board of directors? So you're looking at those type of consequences when something goes wrong, and therefore in the scheme of things, the cost of implementing this and having an effective quality system is going to be much less costly in the event of a breach and something goes wrong. The cost of addressing that, the resources, the cost of legal is all something that you're going to have to take into effect. The next slide, Rick. The benefits, obviously, improve the traceability. So this is the genealogy through the supply chain, the genesis of the supply chain. Obviously, the enhancement of capturing data and details beyond the NDC or in the lot and the expiration serial number, serialization today that you'll be able to do or in the future. Your ability to verify the products throughout the supply chain. Again, U.S. Customs has a program called CTPAT. Very similar type of program. I wouldn't say very similar, but a program, again, that's looking to establish where the product is entirely from overseas to the importer here in the U.S. Again, those are areas you can look at to leverage. Reduce the risk of counterfeits through improvement in the visibility of supply chain. Again, I mentioned, look at the FDA. They do issue threat alerts. There's also a good organization called NICB, the National Insurance Crimes Bureau, that also does studies. It's an association that you could join. There's no cost for joining it. They address various areas. They have real practitioners from federal agents, FBI, state agencies, etc. They're members of this, and they share the information. So the NICB is another resource for you. And again, the operational benefits of the information. It's encoded on the product. It's transmitted from partner to partner. It's stored in your data warehouse. Again, the EDI is what you're going to want to be focusing on from an IT perspective in order to make this manageable in the future. Again, depending on the size of your organization and your company. I think there's one more slide. If you could turn the slide. Okay, preparing for the DSCSA. Obviously, first step is to review the regulations, parcel the regulations according to the products, what you fall into, whether you're a wholesaler, a distributor, a pharmacy, and then look at that as far as what you're going to need to implement. Look at whether you have the appropriate staff there. Look at the implementation schedules and the deadlines, and then go from there. Establish a policy procedures to mitigate the scenarios. Again, you look at the guidelines of the FDA, leverage those, establish your SOPs standard operating procedures, look at what other case scenarios have been in the past, real case scenarios, and try to identify the weaknesses that were flagged in those cases, and then see how they apply to your company and how you could address it. That's usually the best way to build your compliance program. Learn from the mistakes of others. Then establish the policies and procedures so you could quickly identify and determine. I've worked for multi-billion-dollar companies. I've had corporate compliance policies that have been no more than 30 pages long. I believe in the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. It tends to be more effective. What I would recommend, and this is just a personal preference, is I build a corporate policy that obviously addresses each of the points of the DSCSA. I then develop departmental policies, so whether it's quality control, procurement, logistics, shipping, receiving, manufacturing, and then from there, the desktop operations. I take the key critical areas of those standard operating procedures, I cut those out, and I put them into an ISO, let's say 9000 system, a quality control system, and become self-policing. And that tends to be the most effective way to handle these type of complex regulatory areas. Obviously, then you consult with your wholesalers, determine what they have in place. Obviously, this is still an evolving area. In order to make sure that they're complying, I highly recommend that your terms and conditions address this as well. You're going to want to make sure that you have the ability to go on-site and audit that your trading partners, that they are complying with this. And again, you're looking at it from a liability standpoint. If you could show in the event of a recall or in a case where there are deaths to the consumer and the patients, that, okay, you looked at the FDA guidelines, you looked at what their recommendations were, you looked at previous real-world case examples, and then you had the T's and C's in place, you had the training, you did hypothetical drills. That's going to be a huge mitigating factor in an enforcement case and or a lawsuit. Obviously, you're going to budget for implementing, sustaining the plan, create, receive, as you can see there. Next slide. These are some references that you could take a look at, again, building your compliance program around that. There's a wealth of information in there that you can use to assist in building your program. Highly recommend, if you haven't already, to take a look in that and see what you can use there to move forward with. Next slide. I think that concludes it. Yes, it does. If you have any questions, you can email info@GTSCI. I believe they also will be, I know there's some medical companies located both domestically and overseas on this webinar that also produce medical devices. GTSCI will be having an importing medical devices nuts and bolts webinar next month, I believe June 9th. You may want to check their webinar and seminar page to see the details on that agenda. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to make it clear, even though I am an attorney, this does not constitute any type of legal advice. These are my personal experiences and opinions, and this was merely for educational purposes. This is a very complex area of the law. So I highly recommend, if you're a layperson, to engage counsel to ensure that you have the appropriate staff and expertise to address this area of the law. It is complex, even for attorneys like myself. So highly recommend that you do reach out to your local, to your in-house counsel or outside counsel if you don't have in-house counsel. Because again, this was merely for educational purposes. I believe, Rick, that we have slightly more than 5 minutes, barely, for Q&As.
Yes. We have 6 minutes for Q&A, so I have several questions. I'll just try to get through these pretty quickly. First one just came in. Are 3PLs deemed licensed until federal and state licenses are issued?
Can you rephrase that question?
I'll have to ask Christine if she could rephrase that. It looks like it might have
If
been
they're
cut off.
asking whether 3PL, or they ask you whether 3PL provider has to apply with the FDA, as far as 3PLs, I guess if they're asking, I guess with 3PLs and warehouse distributors systems, the FDA has not yet established this criteria. Basically, the FDA, so you understand, the FDA is not in the business to license entities. They'll only interject, it's very important to understand that under the Act, actually, that interject if a state licensing requirements are inadequate. So they expect the states to implement the standards to meet the federal standards. So as far as 3PLs are concerned, if you are hesitant as far as your state licensing requirements may be, I would reach out to your local state entity and get guidance for this. It's going to take time for the states to implement the new FDA requirements, and so that's the approach that I would take.
Okay, the next question was, can you recommend a source which will dictate the requirements on what content should be a part of TI, TH, and TS?
Can I recommend a source? I don't specifically will endorse any particular company. There are companies out there that do handle this, but I would just say take a look at the industry, take a look at your industry periodicals, and go from there as to what companies are out there, and then obviously solicit for quotes and see what they come back with.
Okay, and there was a clarification on that previous question. It was, are 3PLs deemed licensed until federal and state licenses are created? So the scenario where the state license has not been created yet.
No, they're not.
Okay. If a state requires us to have a license and there is no 3PL license available yet, what do we do?
If a state requires they have a license but there's no 3PL license, then obviously it's inapplicable, if that's what they're asking.
All right.
So if the state hasn't implemented, so let's just say hypothetically, the FDA hasn't yet established a 3PL system, but let's say hypothetically the state is looking to establish something like that but doesn't have the system in place. They obviously, there's no way of complying with that requirement, with that state requirement. So again, they would take that up with the local authorities. Okay.
Next question is, I have heard of a two-dimensional barcoding system. What exactly does that entail?
The two-dimensional barcoding system, I think, is a two-phase program. Is what you could think of the act of the two-phase program. So the phase one, obviously, you have the reporting requirements and the transaction activity that's going to have to be exchanged between each of your trading partners. The phase two, which is going to begin next year, involves that two-dimensional barcode containing product information. So this could be required on drug packaged homogeneous type of cases. Those will be the first in line to require this. Then you have till 2023 for the two-dimensional ID that's going to be required on the unit level packaging. So the test the labels would be a good example today. But a product by 2023, at the end of the implementation, is not going to be allowed. It's very important to understand, even though 2023 seems a long way distance, it could creep on you pretty quick, is not going to be allowed to move in the supply chain without that unit level traceability between all the trading partners. So again, that goes back to who are your trading partners and how are they going to address this type of two-dimensional ID, which is required by 2023. And then obviously you got the manufacturing process and the manufacturing floor issues in order to be able to implement this as well. So you've got a lot of moving parts in order to address that.
And one last brief question. Can the exchange of the T3 information occur with paper records rather than electronically? We currently are very manually intensive.
Yes, they can. That's for now. And I know a lot of companies are still using Excel spreadsheets, even though they may have SAP or Oracle as their enterprise systems. Again, keep in mind the EDI requirements down the road. It's okay to exchange this type of T3 information using paper records, but again, by November 2017, you know, the manufacturers are going to be required to have this in electronic format. So this is basically what I call the first wave of serialized, you know, identification multi-packs. So you literally have 6 months to get your IT department up and on board in order to have that type of electronic interface between the wholesaler, the distributor, the manufacturer, you know, dispensary would be something to look at. And again, look at this done with their ACE program. For those that are importing drugs into the U.S. today, they've moved into one single platform. It hasn't been the best, but they've had some technical issues with it, but that's basically what you're going to be looking at. But if you currently have nothing in place as far as your corporate initiatives are from an IT standpoint, I would say jump on that today, because again, you have by November 2017, at least manufacturers are going to be required to provide the information in electronic format, not in paper format.
Excellent. We've come to the end of our hour. There were a couple of other questions that had come in, and so I would refer the audience to the email on your screen. You can send those questions to info@gtsci.org. We'll make sure that Christos gets those questions and can reply to you directly. Christos, did you have any final comments?
No, that was it. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us on this webinar. I know it's late in some of the folks who called in from overseas, and hope that you found this information useful. Again, the references that we had on the previous slide have a wealth of information. I can't reiterate that. Take a look at the FDA guidelines, take a look at what they have out there, and base your compliance program and how you're going to meet those standards. So there's a wealth of information there. Again, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Rick, for excellent job in moderating again.
Okay, well that concludes today's webinar. This webinar was recorded and the link will be sent out to all registrants tomorrow. We'll have the recording available at www.gtsci.org. And that's all for today.
Thank you.